So this is a continuation of our discussion of playing lines that limit responses, dictate the kind of game you play, yet still require precision on your opponent's parts. In these examples, these openings are basically unsound chess. Somebody plays perfectly against you, they're going to get at least equality, and in some cases, according to the computer, after three moves, you're 1.5 pawns down. So if you're playing somebody like Stockfish or Komodo, you're going to lose. So this is about human on human chess and what it takes for people to respond correctly to these situations. Now, all these games are against people who are, well, I would say 2100 and up. Um, I don't want to, divulge the exact nature of like everybody's names, and I'll cover that in a separate video. But it's absolutely unnecessary as far as I'm concerned. So, in this case, I'm black, and my opponent is playing a standard opening, and I'm using the Latvian Gambit, which, if you look it up on the web and you look at the history of the Latvian Gambit, it was all the rage, and there were even people that there was Latvian chess clubs that played other chess clubs and came out quite well in over-the-board competitions. I believe in the Latvian Gambit. There are lines against it that completely hurt it, so beware of that. A large number of people know the Latvian Gambit from the white side, and they play this move, which is considered best. And at this point, your queen is coming out early, and it's reminiscent of something like Nakamura might try, um, but it's not the healthiest situation. You have to really be on top of your understanding of what to do in this opening. So he's made the proper knight retreat. Now we recover our pawn, and he moves bishop to e2. Now, amazingly, the computers, and I just looked at this actually in Komodo 10, its top two moves are queen to f7 here and queen to d8, both of which I've seen, and both of which make no sense to me whatsoever. So, as a human being, I don't really like this kind of situation. And what happens is you can't move your queen to g6. This opening has a lot to do with pressuring white's g-pawn, moving your queen to g6, and trying to get in bishop to h3 and things like that. Ultimately, you're going to see this happen in this game. So, how do I get around it? What happens? Well, it happens through playing an inferior order of moves, and we're going to start by showing you that order. So now we attack the d-pawn, and the proper response for white is to push that pawn. And when he pushes the pawn, obviously there's the potential for a lot of really ugly things to happen. For instance, the knight's going to have to move, and when the knight moves, we're going to get a check on b5 most likely. So the potential exists for a displaced king and castling by hand on the queen side, and a lot of strange, ugly-looking things. So 9 out of 10 players that I play don't seem to really want to push. They just see that I'm going to go knight to e5, and they're going to exchange, and I'm going to get my queen on e5, and the world's going to be happy. They're going to have an overextended d-pawn, and they're not interested in playing this kind of wild, wide-open situation, with a lot of queen development early. So that's the move we see a lot, and then they get this move. And white's position is still fine, and in fact, white's probably up, and obviously if they go to e5, they lose a pawn, so that's a retreat that they can make. And now the computers recommend bishop to f5 here, and bishop to f5 has the virtue of the fact that this is a classic case where Nimzovich would move pawn to c4 and undermine your e-pawn, trying to attack the pawn chain at its base. There are a variety of things we can do here. For instance, I would suggest bishop to e6 is my favorite move, but that's not something the computer likes. It's something that works for me, however. So after castling and castling, we get the c4 move anyway. And now, of course, we have to worry about things like pawn takes pawn, bishop takes back, and the knight to c3, which is going to really put pressure on that e-pawn, and the pawn chain is going to start falling apart. However, we've got the interesting resource here of the fact that the d-pawn is hanging. And since it's hanging and there's a bishop on e2, little zwish and zugs like if we play knight takes pawn, and he plays knight takes e-pawn, we get knight takes check in, and he just loses a piece. So we can probably just safely capture his d-pawn at this point, but in these kind of positions I tend to look for a little more. And the more complicated it becomes and the more time my opponent takes up and the more difficult these situations are, it's obvious this person does not know opening theory about this particular opening. So I'm going to play a series of B moves here that look like they're not the best moves in the world, starting with that. And that move in particular has two different ideas. Number one, if he starts playing things like f3, I'm going to move queen to h4 and start a blazing kingside attack. And if he captures, which is probably what he should do, and move knight to c3, I'm still set up for a kingside attack, and I've got space to move my knight now with tempo to e7, my king's knight. So in reality, I'm provoking c5, and if he plays c5, all of a sudden all my issues with the pawn chain go away. Also notice his d-pawn is still hanging, and I still can pressure his d-pawn and take it, although I'm not going to. He's going to push, I'm going to move back. Now, the ideal time to take it is after his next move, where he simply decides he wants to double my pawns. And once again, knight takes d-pawn seems like a completely appropriate and good move, and it probably gives black a good pawn advantage at least. But I'm going to play for something increasingly bizarre, and that's that I want to develop all my pieces. I want to start an attack on the king side. It doesn't look like I have a great capability of doing it, and on top of it, I'm going to leave my queen side pawns doubled on purpose. I could move my bishop and retake with the queen, or I could just play knight takes pawn, all of which are perfectly good moves, and I would even recommend them. But in this particular case, I decided to allow the capture. And I moved knight to h6, getting development, headed toward g4, f5. And he just took, which is pretty delicious looking. And I would expect queen to a4 at this point, but he decided that he needed to attack my king side. And this is where things start to go downhill. When the player starts ignoring, the initial plan of what, going after the weaknesses he's created. My plan, of course, is if he moves to queen a4, I was simply to move king to d7 right away. If I move king to d7, he's going to capture my a pawn, and then it becomes, can he queen his a pawn, and how can he attack that c6 pawn? And it's going to turn out to be fairly difficult, actually. I can cover it a variety of ways, and that is an opportunity for him. However, what we're going to do here is we're going to continue to attack the king side. And when we attack the king side, we're going to go after that g-pawn directly and threaten bishop to h3. And now he takes, and we take back, and now he moves queen to a4, and now we attack the king side. So if he decides to check, I'll just move king to d7, and then he'll be kind of stuck for a move, and it'll follow the regular game line. I would say at this point it's very probable white has already lost. So he moves, he covers his g-pawn. He could have tried pushing g3. And then there are whole varieties of things that can happen. Knight to g4, knight to f5. In fact, knight to g4 is possible right now. And I would suggest knight to g4 as being one of the stronger lines, resulting in, if he takes the bishop, we get the discovered attack on his position. In fact, we have a choice of pieces to take. So my advice at this point would be knight to g4. I played my rook over, recognizing the fact that his only saving move in this position is probably rook to e2. Because if he plays rook takes rook, obviously it's maiden 1 on g2. And so at this point, I'm going to basically say that after his next move, white resigned pretty much, and the game was over. So I would just show this game as an example of, we have a really ugly bunch of pawn islands here. Black's got a set of isolated pawns. His only sound pawns are on h7 and g7. Doubled isolated pawn islands. If it gets to an ending, things aren't going to look good. However, white's got two very active bishops. He's got a bishop ready to go to, g5. I mean, basically, the problem with white's position is he's got a knight on b1. He's playing a knight and a rook down, and he is incapable of defending his king side at this point. So he has kind of what looks like ought to be a decent attack, but even the c6 pawn is covered. So he just made one or two slightly errant moves, and this game was over. And that was the moral of the story in this particular game, and I thought I would share it with you.